Picture an 80-year-old billionaire celebrating his birthday, right? But he is not surrounded by, a string quartet or some fancy country club gala.
Right.
He's flanked by military jet fighters. He's surrounded by the blood and sweat of a mixed martial arts cage fighting arena, and he's just pumping his fist to this roaring crowd.
It's quite the visual.
It really is. So take that image, right, and hold it in your mind alongside a completely different one. Picture a heavily guarded, completely silent underground vault in Beijing, and it's just quietly filling up with thousands of tons of physical gold bricks.
Oh, okay. Yep. Two very different vibes.
Exactly. And okay, finally, place both of those next to a theological debate that happened like 500 years ago in Europe about the nature of the individual soul.
I mean, honestly, it sounds like the setup to an incredibly esoteric joke.
Right. But it's not. I mean, if you want to understand the exact moment in history that you and I are living through right now, you really have to realize that these three seemingly completely disconnected things, the cage fight, the gold vault, and the 16th century philosopher, they're all pointing to the exact same massive global crisis.
Yeah, and it's a crisis that's unfolding, right under our noses.
Totally. So today we are unpacking a truly dense, just fascinating stack of source material. We're looking at a translated transcript from a symposium that was hosted in the Netherlands by a program called De Nieuwe Wereld, which translates to the New World.
Yeah, and the speakers they assembled for this, I mean, they're formidable. You have two philosophers, Verbrugge and Jelle van Baardewijk.
Right.
And they're sitting down with Willem Middelkoop, who is this very prominent financial and geopolitical analyst. And what makes this conversation so compelling is that they aren't just looking at isolated data points,
Yeah, they're zooming way out.
Exactly. They are cross-referencing their disciplines to map out this structural, almost inevitable decline of the current Western-led world order.
And so our mission in this deep dive is to basically connect their dots for you. We're going to decode how the shifting cultural zeitgeist, the mathematical endgame of the U.S. dollar, and the aggressive geopolitical chess moves of the BRICS nations they're all part of one unified map.
It's all connected.
It is. By the time we finish, the goal is for you to have a comprehensive understanding of the ground that's shifting beneath your feet. But before we launch in, we should probably do a crucial disclaimer.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the symposium transcript touches heavily on highly polarized political figures. We're talking Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and it navigates through some very sensitive global conflicts.
Right. Which means we really need to state up front that we are strictly analyzing the viewpoints, the historical cycles, and the data presented by these specific speakers.
Exactly. We are not taking sides.
No. Nor are we endorsing any of the political stances, left, right, east, or west that are found in the text. Our role here is strictly impartial analysis. We just want to break down the arguments so you can understand the underlying geopolitical mechanics.
Right. We're just reading the map. So
yeah.
Let's start with the cage fight. Because Jelle van Baardewijk opens this symposium with a really striking cultural observation. He brings up that image of Donald Trump's recent birthday, right? Bathed in the imagery of military might and the brutal enclosed combat of MMA.
Yeah.
And Van Baardewijk contrasts that visceral American imagery with something that is very dear to the Dutch.
Total football.
Total football, yeah.
For listeners who aren't avid soccer historians, total football is this tactical theory where any outfield player can take over the role of any other player on the team.
It's incredibly fluid.
Super fluid. It was pioneered by the Dutch in the 1970s, famously with Johan Cruyff. And it's all about this elegant team-based strategy. Every single player has to understand the geometry of the entire pitch.
Right. It requires an intense level of multilateral coordination. You're constantly analyzing open space, moving in total harmony.
But the vulnerability of total football is that if one single player is out of position or, just refuses to cooperate, the entire defensive line collapses.
This is highly technical, but incredibly fragile.
Exactly. And Van Baardewijk is using this as a profound metaphor for global politics, right?
No.
Total football represents the fading era of Western-led multilateral institutions.
Like the UN or NATO.
Exactly. The UN, the World Trade Organization, the EU, that entire post-World War II order was built on highly coordinated, rules-based, team-based diplomacy.
You have to play your position.
Right. It requires everyone to play their part perfectly, to respect the referee and to maintain their position.
But wait. Isn't a political rally at a UFC fight just entertainment? Why are these philosophers reading a massive structural global shift into a politician just watching a cage match? Isn't it just a demographic play for voters?
Well, sure, it is a demographic play. But the deeper question the symposium asks is, why does that imagery appeal to that demographic right now?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. We are moving away from the complex, fragile coordination of the football pitch and entering what Van Baardewijk describes as this gladiatorial era of strongman politics.
Like flipping the chessboard over.
Exactly. The appeal of the cage fight isn't its complexity,
Mm.
It's raw, undeniable certainty. I mean, there are no multilateral treaties in an MMA cage.
Right, no vetoes.
No vetoes. There is just absolute localized physical dominance. You really can't debate a knockout.
No, you can't. And this actually connects to something deeply historical in the text.
Yeah.
They bring in Oswald Spengler, the early 20th century historian who wrote The Decline of the West.
Spengler is so crucial here because he categorized historical cultures by their core defining symbols.
Okay.
And he argued that the Greco-Roman culture, classical antiquity, the era that gave us the Colosseum, was fundamentally obsessed with a localized physical body.
Like the marble statues.
Okay.
Perfect proportions.
Exactly. Perfect proportions, tangible limits, raw physical power happening right in front of you. The gladiator in the arena is the ultimate manifestation of that culture. It's two bodies, enclosed in a defined space, establishing a hierarchy through force.
But Spengler contrasted that with the modern West,
Yeah.
right, which he called Faustian culture. And Faustian culture, according to him, doesn't care about the enclosed arena at all. It's obsessed with mastering infinite space.
Precisely. The Faustian drive is about pushing boundaries outward. I mean, it's the drive that created the age of global exploration, right? Or the invention of the telescope to map the cosmos.
And eventually creating globalized institutions that try to map rules across the entire planet.
Yes. Total football, utilizing the entire field, passing a ball into empty space based on some theoretical geometry that is a deeply Faustian endeavor. It's all about conquering space through complex strategy.
So what Van Baardewijk is suggesting here is that the West is essentially suffering from a sort of spatial exhaustion. Like, we built this massive, complex, global football pitch of treaties and supply chains, but the populations living inside it are just exhausted by how fragile it all is.
Yeah, the mental load is too high.
Right, so they are regressing, or maybe retreating, back to the Greco-Roman obsession with localized bodily power. We just want the strong man now. We want the gladiator to step in and provide absolute certainty.
And Verbrugge builds on this by pointing out a massive psychological pivot that has happened just like in the last decade. He notes that for a long time, Western culture was heavily focused on the narrative of the victim.
Oh yeah, we saw this everywhere. Like in debates about multiculturalism or the reevaluation of historical grievances, the whole cultural center of gravity was focused on acknowledging and protecting those who had been marginalized by the system.
Right. But Verbrugge observes that that era is rapidly closing. We are witnessing the sudden, stark cultural shift back to the warrior archetype.
Yeah, he points to the sudden militarization of Europe. Countries that spent, decades underfunding their militaries and championing pacifism are suddenly pivoting to war economies.
And having debates about mandatory conscription.
Exactly. The traditional peace movement has almost completely evaporated. Suddenly, being a warrior, being armed and ready for physical confrontation, is being framed as a heroic moral necessity.
Yeah, and he uses the example of Donald Trump's immediate reaction after the assassination attempt, right? Pumping his fist, yelling, "Fight."
It's the ultimate gladiator imagery, broadcast globally.
And the cultural resonance of that image was undeniable. But, and this is key, this raises the critical analytical question of the symposium. Is this gladiator posture a sign of a society's actual strength, or is it an illusion masking a structural decline?
I mean, a dying animal often puffs itself up to look larger, right?
Exactly. Verbrugge suggests that this hyper-masculine warrior posturing on the political stage is happening precisely at the moment when American and Western global hegemony is structurally hollowing out.
So it's a marketing facade.
Yeah. When the complex machinery of your empire starts failing, you replace it with the performance of raw strength.
Wow. And that structural failure really brings us to the financial and geopolitical data presented by Willem Middelkoop. Because this cultural shift toward the strongman, it isn't happening in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
It's the psychological reaction to a quantifiable decline in American power. Middelkoop provides a specific geopolitical example from the text. an alleged 14-point peace deal regarding Iran.
Right. So the source text mentions a geopolitical analyst who reviewed the contours of this sort of back-channel 14-point arrangement.
And it heavily favors Iran, right?
Oh, entirely.
Yeah.
The details involve things like the U.S. quietly unfreezing billions in Iranian assets and just turning a blind eye to Iranian oil exports to China.
And in exchange?
In exchange, Iran merely caps its uranium enrichment at current levels and pauses proxy attacks on U.S. bases.
So Middelkoop frames this vividly. He says the analyst looked at this deal and described it as a 6-2 victory for Iran in football terms.
Which is just a striking metric when you think about the historical context, because for the last half-century, the United States has largely dictated terms in the Middle East, right?
Yeah, if a nation went against U.S. interests, they faced crippling airtight sanctions.
Yeah.
Or direct military intervention.
Exactly. The fact that the U.S. is now offering massive economic concessions just to maintain the status quo, just to keep things from escalating, it signals a massive geopolitical retreat.
The U.S. simply no longer has the leverage to enforce its will in the region.
But to understand the mechanics of why the U.S. is losing that leverage, we have to pull way back. We have to look at the macroeconomic timeline.
Right.
Middelkoop anchors his analysis in historical cycles, specifically referring to this 80 to 90-year wave. Some economists call this the Kondratev wave, or, sociologists might refer to it as the fourth turning.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that cycle, because it isn't just like arbitrary numerology.
No, yeah, it's not.
It's based on the lifespan of a human generation and the accumulation of debt. The theory suggests that roughly every 80 to 90 years, a major crisis wipes the slate clean, and a new global leader emerges to set the world order.
The cycle of hegemony. I mean, the Dutch had it in the 1600s, the French in the 1700s, the British Empire controlled the 19th century with the pound sterling.
And finally, the American Empire took the reins.
Right. And the mechanism driving this cycle is usually debt and institutional memory. Because after a massive crisis, like a world war, the survivors build incredibly robust conservative institutions. They remember the pain of the collapse.
But over the decades, those original architects die off.
Exactly. Their children and grandchildren, who only know stability, they start taking risks. They start accumulating debt, assuming the system is just invincible.
Right, because it's always been fine in their lifetime.
Yeah. And by the time you get 80 years out, the debt burden is suffocating, the institutions are corrupted or complacent, and the system fractures under its own weight, leading to a new crisis.
And the timeline here is what makes this so immediate for us. We're currently 82 years out from 1944.
Yeah. And 1944 is ground zero for the modern world. That was the Bretton Woods Conference.
Right. The U.S. government invited delegates from 44 nations to a hotel in New Hampshire. While World War II was still raging, Europe was economically decimated.
But the U.S. was an industrial juggernaut. And crucially, they held the vast majority of the world's physical gold reserves.
Because Europe had been sending their gold to America to buy weapons and supplies for years.
Exactly. So at Bretton Woods, the U.S. dictated the terms of the new global financial system. They established the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency.
But it wasn't just a fiat currency back then, right? It came with a hard promise.
Yes. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce.
So the dollar was essentially just a paper receipt for physical gold held in a vault somewhere. If you're the central bank of France or Japan, you had total confidence holding U.S. dollars. Because you knew, at any time, you could hand those paper dollars back to the U.S. Treasury and they would hand you a physical bar of gold.
Right. And it provided the ultimate stability required to rebuild global trade. But the discipline required to maintain that peg, well, it didn't last.
Surprise, surprise.
Right. By the 1960s, the U.S. was running massive budget deficits. President Lyndon B. Johnson was trying to fund the Vietnam War abroad and his Great Society social programs at home, the famous guns and butter policy.
And you can't print physical gold, but you can definitely print paper dollars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The U.S., they started printing vastly more dollars than they had gold to back them up. And the rest of the world wasn't stupid.
Wow.
Countries, particularly France, under Charles de Gaulle, looked at the balance sheet, realized the U.S. was diluting the currency, and started aggressively demanding their gold back.
They were literally sending ships full of paper dollars to New York
Yeah.
and taking physical gold back to Paris.
A literal run on the bank. And the U.S. gold reserves just plummeted.
They halved, right.
Yeah, they halved. The situation became completely untenable. So in 1971, we get what is known as the Nixon shock. President Richard Nixon went on television and announced that he was, quote-unquote, temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
A temporary measure that is now, what, 55 years old?
Right.
At that moment, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by absolutely nothing tangible, only the full faith and credit of the U.S. government.
Now, economic theory dictates that when a nation severs its currency from its hard asset backing and continues to run massive deficits, that currency should collapse.
Yeah, the world should have abandoned the dollar in the 1970s.
Exactly.
So here's where it gets really interesting for me. If the fundamental promise of 1944 was broken, why on earth did the rest of the world keep using the dollar? How did the U.S. manage to keep it as the undisputed king of global finance for the next half-century?
Because of one of the most brilliant, high-stakes geopolitical pivots in history. The source highlights the role of U.S. officials, notably Henry Kissinger, in 1974.
Okay.
They flew to Saudi Arabia and struck a deal with the Saudi royal family and, by extension, the rest of the OPEC nations.
This is the birth of the petrodollar.
Yes.
Yeah.
The mechanics of the deal were ingenious. Saudi Arabia agreed that going forward, they would only sell their oil in U.S. dollars. They would refuse any other currency.
Wow.
And in exchange, the United States guaranteed the military protection of the Saudi kingdom, providing them with advanced weaponry and geopolitical cover.
Let's walk through the implications of that because it is essentially the hidden engine of the modern world.
It really is.
If you are Japan or Germany or South Korea, your economy requires massive amounts of imported oil just to function. If OPEC only accepts dollars, that means you absolutely must hold huge reserves of U.S. dollars to survive.
You have to manufacture goods, export them to America, earn dollars, just so you can turn around and buy energy.
Right. It created an artificial, permanent, and mandatory global demand for the U.S. dollar. But wait, what did the Saudis do with all those billions of dollars they earned? They couldn't possibly spend it all domestically.
No, they couldn't. So part of the deal was that they would recycle those petrodollars by investing them back into U.S. Treasury bonds.
They loaned the money back to the U.S. government.
Yes. This allowed the United States to continue printing money and running massive federal deficits without suffering the hyperinflation you would typically expect.
Because the rest of the world acted as a sponge, absorbing those excess dollars because they needed them for energy.
Exactly. It effectively gave the U.S. a magical checkbook.
But Middelkoop argues that this exact system, the petrodollar foundation, is what is breaking down today. I mean, the U.S. military is no longer viewed as the invincible guarantor of security in the Middle East, and countries are finally starting to trade oil in other currencies, like the Chinese yuan.
Which triggers the data point that Middelkoop focuses heavily on, a silent, massive bank run happening on a global scale.
Right. And it's not citizens lining up outside local banks, it's central banks.
Yeah. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the central banks of the world have been quietly but aggressively fleeing back to gold. According to the text, they are buying over 1,000 tons of physical gold every single year.
I want to pause on that because, you might reasonably ask, why gold? I mean, in an era of high-frequency trading, AI, digital currencies, gold is a heavy, illiquid analog metal. It yields absolutely no interest. Storing it costs a fortune. Why would modern digitized central banks regress to hoarding shiny rocks in a basement?
It's the ultimate boomer asset, right?
Exactly. Why are they doing this?
Because gold has one unique property that no fiat currency or digital asset can claim. It carries zero counterparty risk.
Okay, explain counterparty risk in this context.
So if a central bank holds U.S. Treasury bonds, that wealth is dependent on the United States honoring its debt. If you hold digital dollars in the SWIFT banking system, that wealth is dependent on the network operators actually allowing you access.
You are reliant on a counterparty.
Right. But if you hold a physical bar of gold in your own sovereign vault, no foreign government can turn it off. No one can sanction it. No one can print more of it and dilute its value.
And the urgency to acquire assets with zero counterparty risk skyrocketed recently. The source notes that this buying spree accelerated massively after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, the U.S. and its European allies responded by freezing roughly $300 billion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves.
With just a few keystrokes in Washington and Brussels, half of Russia's national savings evaporated from the global banking system.
The weaponization of the dollar.
Exactly.
It was intended to punish Russia, but it sent a terrifying shockwave through every other non-Western central bank in the world.
India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, China.
They all looked at that action and realized a chilling truth. Our dollar reserves are not actually our money. They're just permissions granted by the United States, and those permissions can be revoked at any time.
Yeah. So today, according to the data presented in the deep dive sources, 24% of global national reserves are now held in physical gold.
Which actually surpasses the amount held in U.S. Treasuries.
The scale of that shift is monumental. And even more telling, 45% of central banks surveyed plan to buy more gold in the next 12 months.
And Middelkoop asks a profound question regarding this data. What do central banks know that we don't? His conclusion is that the smartest financial institutions on Earth are looking at the sovereign debt math of the United States, and they have realized it is no longer sustainable.
Let's do that math because it is terrifying.
Yeah.
The U.S. national debt is currently sitting at $39 trillion, and it is growing by roughly $2 trillion every single year.
To put that in perspective, the interest payments alone on that debt, just servicing the interest, not paying down a single cent of the principal, those payments now exceed the entire budget of the U.S. military. It is an exponential curve. It requires an ever-increasing portion of tax revenue, which eventually forces the central bank to print more money just to pay the interest, creating this awful inflationary spiral.
So the countries east of Germany, the global south, the non-Western nations, they're looking at this balance sheet. They're looking at the political weaponization of the dollar via sanctions, and they're simply opting out.
Yeah, they aren't writing angry letters. They're quietly repatriating their gold from vaults in London and New York and taking physical possession of it on their own soil.
It is a systematic dismantling of the financial foundation of the American empire. The world is gradually rejecting the unbacked, weaponized dollar and returning to the oldest, most historically undeniable store of value.
But history shows us that fading empires don't just, politely step aside when their economic machinery starts failing.
Right. They don't just say, well, the debt math looks bad. Here are the keys to the kingdom.
No. Historically, the transition phase of global hegemony is the most turbulent, violent period. When soft economic power fails, empires inevitably resort to hard military or covert power to maintain their grip. Middelkoop refers to this dynamic as imperial overstretch.
And the symposium text provides a jaw-dropping statistic to illustrate this overstretch. Between 1949 and 2014, the United States engaged in 101 regime change campaigns globally.
101 distinct interventions. That includes everything from overt military invasions to covert CIA operations designed to alter election outcomes, fund opposition groups, or outright topple sovereign governments.
Now, the official narrative for these interventions usually revolves around spreading democracy, protecting human rights, stopping the spread of communism. But the text makes a very specific, much more cynical claim about who actually gets targeted.
It's not just about ideology.
No, it's about protecting the dollar hegemony. The source explicitly points to leaders who crossed a very specific red line, attempting to abandon the U.S. dollar for the pricing of their natural resources.
Let's look at the examples given. Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In 2000, he announced that Iraq would no longer accept U.S. dollars for its oil exports. He demanded to be paid in euros.
Right. And if a major oil producer successfully transitions away from the dollar, it threatens the entire petrodollar system we just discussed.
It reduces the global demand for dollars, which means the U.S. can't export its inflation. And while a few years after that announcement, the U.S. invaded Iraq.
The text also points to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Before he was overthrown, Gaddafi was actively organizing a plan to create a Pan-African currency called the gold dinar.
Right, he wanted the entire African continent to stop using Western fiat currencies and only accept this gold-backed currency for their vast natural resources.
Again, a direct existential threat to the financial architecture of the West. Middelkoop cynically notes a pattern. Wherever the U.S. military intervenes to, bring democracy, they also conveniently seem to seize the central bank and the gold reserves.
The implication from the speakers is clear. Challenging the petrodollar is the ultimate geopolitical sin.
But there is a limit to this strategy. I mean, you can only play the regime change card so many times against isolated, weaker nations before the rest of the world wises up and bands together. You can't regime change a superpower.
No, you can't. And that brings us to the rise of the BRICS nations. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, alongside their new members.
BRICS is basically the inevitable geopolitical counterweight to U.S. imperial overstretch. The global south has watched the fate of Iraq, the fate of Libya, the freezing of Russia's reserves, and they concluded that remaining dependent on Western financial infrastructure is a matter of national suicide.
Right. And BRICS is often dismissed in Western media as just a disorganized talking shop. They point out that China and India have border disputes or that Brazil and Russia have different economic models.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
But that completely misses the point. BRICS isn't an ideological alliance like NATO. It is a defensive financial coalition. They are actively building an alternative plumbing system for global finance.
So how does that actually work in practice? How do you bypass the US dollar?
Through mechanisms like bilateral currency swaps. Traditionally, if Brazil wanted to buy manufactured goods from China, Brazil would have to exchange its local currency, the real, for US dollars, route that transaction through a clearinghouse in New York, and then China would receive those dollars.
Which means the US banking system takes a fee. But more importantly, the US government has absolute visibility and veto power over that trade.
Exactly. If they want to sanction it, they just block the transaction in New York.
Right. So what BRICS is doing is establishing direct clearing mechanisms.
Yes. They are building alternatives to the SWIFT messaging system, like China's CIPS network. So now Brazil can pay China directly using local currencies, entirely bypassing the Western financial arteries. The U.S. loses both the fee and the geopolitical leverage.
Well, let me offer an analogy to make this crystal clear for everyone. Imagine you live in a town and you are locked into a terrible contract with a monopoly telecom company. The service is spotty, the fees keep going up every year, and they monitor all your calls.
Sounds awful.
Right. Furthermore, every time you try to complain, they threaten to shut off your service completely and leave you isolated.
Yeah.
You hate them, but you're trapped because they own the only cell tower in town.
That's the unipolar U.S. dollar system.
Exactly. But then, suddenly, a new massive company comes along, let's call them China. And they don't just offer you a cheaper phone plan. They offer to physically build a brand new state-of-the-art cell tower right in your backyard.
Wow.
And here's a kicker. They don't ask about your credit score, they don't demand you change your political affiliations, and they don't lecture you on human rights. They just build the tower.
You'd switch your service immediately.
In a heartbeat.
And the transcript features a brilliant, very blank quote from an African politician that captures this exact dynamic. He said, "When the American ambassador visits, we get a lecture. When the Chinese ambassador visits, we get an airport."
Or a railway.
Yeah.
Or a seaport.
Yeah.
It is a purely transactional, highly effective strategy. The source notes that just 25 years ago, the United States was the dominant, largest trading partner for the vast majority of nations in Africa and South America. Today, China is the largest trading partner for almost all of them. The global supply chain has completely rewired itself while the West was distracted.
And China's strategy is ultimately a numbers game. Xi Jinping deeply understands the demographics. The BRICS nations, including their new additions, represent roughly 4 billion people.
4 billion.
And they control vast amounts of the world's energy, agriculture, and rare earth minerals.
While the Western Alliance, the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, represents only about 1.5 billion people.
When the Global South unites their economic and demographic weight, it fundamentally tilts the gravitational axis of the world. The West is no longer the indispensable center. It is becoming an isolated peninsula.
And what I found so fascinating in the source text is how this macro-level shift in power dynamics is bleeding into micro-level interactions. Middelkoop details these incredibly subtle, almost petty psychological power plays happening on the world stage right now.
Geopolitical theater,
Yeah.
the visual language of diplomacy.
Yeah. He talks about a state visit where Donald Trump went to meet Xi Jinping in Beijing. Xi apparently controlled the seating arrangements down to the literal millimeter. He allegedly placed Trump on a chair with a very soft, deep cushion, while Xi himself sat on a firm, rigid seat.
Oh, wow.
So when Trump sat down, he sank deep into the cushion, resulting in him sitting about 10 centimeters lower than Xi.
It sounds trivial, but in the high-stakes world of statecraft, nothing is accidental.
Nothing.
By forcing the American president to physically look up at the Chinese leader, it establishes an immediate subconscious dominance in the room. And more importantly, that physical hierarchy is captured in the photographs that are broadcast to billions of people globally.
Right, and the power games didn't stop there. When Vladimir Putin visited Xi a week later, he was given the exact same soft chair. But Putin, knowing exactly what the game was, intentionally sprawled out, acting like a big bear, refusing to let his physical posture look diminished.
And the source also recalled an older classic example of this psychological warfare. Vladimir Putin knew that former German Chancellor Angela Merkel was terrified of dogs.
Right.
So during a crucial bilateral meeting, He deliberately brought his large, unrestrained black Labrador into the room to intimidate her and throw her off balance.
It's aggressive, it's petty, but as you said, it's a signal. It's a way for these non-Western leaders to communicate a very specific message to the world. We are no longer intimidated by the West. We don't play by your rules of decorum anymore. We set the terms now.
So we have the cultural shift toward the gladiator, the mathematical collapse of the dollar, and the rise of a highly coordinated rival empire. But the deep dive goes even further.
Right. This is where the philosopher Verbrugge steps in to argue that all of these things, the money, the geopolitics, the military posturing, they're actually just surface ripples.
He takes us down to the tectonic plates. He argues that this crisis isn't just about the last 80 years since Bretton Woods. We are witnessing the climax of a much larger 500-year-old philosophical cycle.
A 500-year wave that is finally cresting and crashing. Verbrugge takes us all the way back to the 16th century, the era of the Renaissance and, crucially, the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, he pinpoints Martin Luther nailing his theses to the church door in 1517 as the ignition point for everything we are experiencing today.
Wait, how does a theological debate from 1517 connect to a BRICS currency swap in 2026?
Because that era burst the underlying operating system of the modern world. Verbrugge outlines the 5 pillars of modernization that were forged during that period, and that the West has subsequently exported or forced upon the rest of the world over the last 5 centuries.
Let's dissect these 5 pillars because this is basically the fundamental architecture of Western society.
Right, so the absolute bedrock, pillar number 1, is the concept of the autonomous individual. Prior to this, your identity was entirely subsumed by your village, your guild, or the Catholic Church.
You were part of a collective.
Exactly. But the Protestant Reformation introduced the radical idea of freedom of conscience, the belief that an individual has a direct personal relationship with God, unmediated by a priest or an institution.
That is a massive theological shift.
And it quickly secularized. That theological idea of individual soul liberty evolved into the political concept of individual rights, individual liberty, and the idea that the individual, not the collective, is the primary sacred unit of society.
Everything in the West, our laws, our art, our consumer habits, it all flows from this premise.
Which leads to the second pillar, rationality. Once you prioritize the individual mind, you begin to reject external dogma, superstition, and magic. The world is no longer a mystical plaything of the gods. It is governed by discoverable rational laws.
And this intellectual shift paved the way for the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution.
Yes.
And once you believe you can rationally understand the laws of nature, you arrive at pillar 3, technology. You apply that rationality to master your environment.
The source points to game-changing technological leaps of that era, like the printing press, which completely democratized information and broke the monopoly of the elite.
Right.
And the Dutch wind-powered sawmill, which I know might sound mundane, but it revolutionized shipbuilding, drastically increasing efficiency and driving the massive wealth of the Dutch Golden Age.
Okay, so you have autonomous individuals thinking rationally, armed with powerful technology. How do you organize them without devolving into chaos? That brings us to pillar 4, the rule of law and the bureaucratic state.
Right. You need a rational, impersonal, standardized system of governance. A bureaucracy that theoretically treats everyone equally and protects those individual rights, managing the immense complexity of a modernizing society.
And finally, pillar 5, the free market economy.
An economic system perfectly tailored for the autonomous individual. It is based on individual choice, private property rights, and the assumption that rational self-interest will lead to collective prosperity.
So the West bundles these 5 pillars together: individualism, rationality, technology, bureaucracy, and free markets. And they package it as modernity. And for centuries, the arrogance of the West was assuming that if any other country wanted to be successful, wealthy, and stable, they had to adopt all 5 pillars exactly as we designed them.
But here is where the symposium introduces a profoundly important insight from the late political scientist Samuel Huntington. Huntington argued that the West's greatest, most catastrophic blind spot was conflating modernization with westernization.
We assumed they were the exact same thing.
We did.
So let me make sure I understand this using our earlier analogy. The West essentially gave the rest of the world the software code to run a highly efficient civilization, the technology, the bureaucratic state, the capitalist markets. But these non-Western countries took that software and installed it on their own, completely different cultural hardware.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Countries like China and Russia looked at Western success and eagerly adopted the technology. Pillar 3. They adopted the complex bureaucratic state apparatus. Pillar 4.
And eventually, they even adopted modified versions of the market economy, Pillar 5, to generate wealth.
But they completely, utterly, and violently rejected Pillar 1, the liberal idea of the autonomous individual.
They looked at the foundation of our entire worldview, the sacred, independent individual, and said, no thanks, we consider that dangerous, we'll keep our own foundation.
Exactly. The source discusses how China operates not as a nation-state in the Western sense, but as a civilizational state.
Right.
Despite having gleaming skyscrapers, high-speed rail, and advanced AI, all the markers of technological modernity, its cultural hardware relies on a deep-seated blend of Marxist authoritarian structure and ancient Confucian values. In that system, harmony, the family, and the collective stability of the state are vastly more important than the rights of any single individual.
Now, to be fair to the source, the text does point out a major contradiction in China's execution of this. They note how the CCP's draconian one-child policy severely damaged those traditional, revered Confucian family structures.
Yeah, leading directly to the crippling demographic crisis China is facing today.
It's a massive vulnerability for them. But the core ideological point remains. China is not on a slow trajectory toward becoming a Western liberal democracy. The assumption that capitalism would inevitably make them democratic was just false.
We see the same dynamic in Russia, which has leaned heavily back into the Russian Orthodox Church and deeply historical, mystical nationalism to unify the state. They are consciously framing themselves in direct opposition to Western liberal values.
So Huntington's thesis is playing out in real time. The world has aggressively modernized, but it is absolutely not Westernized. And now, these non-Western modern states are using the very tools of modernity, our technology, and our market mechanisms to dismantle Western dominance.
But the true tragedy outlined in the symposium isn't just that the rest of the world is challenging the West from the outside. The most fatal blow is that the West is essentially rotting from the inside out.
Wow.
Which brings us to the final, and perhaps most profound, argument in the deep dive. Verbrugge argues that the West is currently experiencing its own 1989 moment.
1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall. The collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right. But we have to ask why the Soviet system collapsed. Verbrugge argues it didn't just fall because it ran out of money. It fell because its foundational ideology, communism, was built on a dangerously incomplete, purely economic view of humanity.
It reduced all human relations, all meaning, to material production and class struggle.
Exactly. It ignored the deeper cultural, spiritual, and communal needs of the human soul. The citizens living inside it knew it was a hollow lie. And eventually, that spiritually bankrupt system couldn't sustain itself, and it evaporated almost overnight.
And his explosive premise here is that Western liberal capitalism is collapsing right now for the exact same reason.
It is a highly provocative parallel. Verbrugge argues that in the decades since we won the Cold War, the West became arrogant and embraced an extreme, mutant form of financialization and hyper-individualism.
We took that first pillar, the autonomous individual, and we pushed it to a radical, toxic extreme.
Yes. We turned absolutely everything into a transaction. We commodified human existence.
The argument in the text is that this hyper-individualism, driven by global market forces, launched a slow, sustained attack on all the foundational non-economic elements of society: community, shared history, the family unit, religious institutions, traditional values.
In the pursuit of pure economic efficiency and absolute individual liberation, all of these historical anchors were redefined as oppressive constraints. They were viewed as friction in the global economic machine that just needed to be dismantled.
The source breaks this down so clearly. Think about the attack on the local community, where you are no longer a rooted citizen of a specific town with obligations to your neighbors. You're just a fluid, atomized global consumer. Think about the attack on history, where your nation's past is no longer a source of shared identity, but is viewed primarily as a ledger of oppressive baggage to be deconstructed and discarded.
And the result, according to Verbrugge, is a population that is floating. We are entirely alienated. We are culturally hollowed out.
We achieved total individual freedom and staggering global economic efficiency, but we lost all the communal anchors that give human life deeper meaning, resilience, and stability.
And this alienation isn't just a philosophical debate for academics. It has explosive, tangible political consequences. The symposium speakers framed the rise of populism across the entire Western world, from Brexit to the political realignments in Europe as a direct, visceral counterreaction to this hollowing out.
Yeah, when millions of people feel completely adrift, when they feel that their transnational financialized elites have stripped away their cultural anchors and shipped their industries overseas, all in the name of corporate efficiency, they react.
And they react aggressively. They reach for any political figure that promises a return to tangible things. Borders, local history, the nation-state, the traditional family.
The text explicitly mentions Donald Trump's America First rhetoric as the prime manifestation of this. It isn't just a political campaign. It is a desperate attempt by a fractured population to hit the emergency brakes on a transnational system they feel is fundamentally destroying their way of life and their identity.
And we must bring Willem Middelkoop's grim financial reality back into this cultural crisis to see the full picture, because this isn't just a spiritual or cultural deficit. It is backed by a literal mathematical deficit.
The 400-year debt limit. When I read this part of the source, my jaw literally dropped. It connects everything perfectly.
The source traces the birth of the modern debt-based financial system back 400 years, again, to the Netherlands.
Right.
The establishment of the first central bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, in 1604. The creation of the first formal stock market in 1607 with the Dutch East India Company. The invention of sovereign bonds.
The entire operating system of modern finance was built on one premise. You can borrow massive amounts of money today, pull wealth from the future based on the promise of perpetual economic growth and future tax revenues to pay it back.
Yes. And for 400 years, Western governments have funded their staggering growth, their global empires, their world wars, and their expansive social welfare programs by stacking debt upon debt upon debt.
But mathematics dictates that you cannot compound debt infinitely. Eventually, the mountain of debt becomes so large that just paying the interest consumes the entire productive capacity of the economy.
And Middelkoop's chilling argument is that mathematically, we have hit the wall. The 400-year credit card is maxed out.
The debt spiral is mathematically out of control, right at the exact historical moment that the cultural cohesion and shared identity required for a society to endure a massive crisis has been completely dismantled by hyper-individualism.
We have no financial buffer left, and we have no cultural buffer left.
So let's look at the board. We have a dying global reserve currency. We have a profoundly alienated, fractured population. We have an unpayable mountain of sovereign debt.
And we have a rising, highly organized alliance of non-Western nations possessing the demographics, the natural resources, and the physical gold to build an entirely new system outside of our control.
Which leads the speakers in the symposium to a shared, very sobering conclusion. The era we have known is over. We are now entering a deeply transitional period. They estimate a highly unpredictable, volatile, chaotic horizon over the next 10 to 20 years.
The certainties that you and I and everyone listening to this have relied on our entire lives are buckling.
Whether that is the purchasing power of the US dollar in your savings account, the political stability of the European Union, or the basic shared cultural norms of your local society, none of it is guaranteed anymore. It is all fundamentally under pressure.
The invisible architecture of the world is being violently redrawn.
Let's try to synthesize this incredible, sprawling journey we've just been on. We started by looking at the gladiator cages of American politics, analyzing how the visceral warrior archetype is replacing the fragile, complex, team-based diplomacy of the post-war era.
Acting as a facade for structural decline.
Right. Then we travel down into the subterranean vaults of Beijing and Mumbai, where central banks are quietly hoarding thousands of tons of physical gold, fleeing a $39 trillion debt bomb, and the weaponization of the U.S. financial system.
We watched leaders like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin engage in petty but profound psychological warfare with chair cushions and dogs,
signaling a global South that is no longer intimidated by the West as they build a new BRICS financial plumbing system. And we traced all of these modern crises all the way back to a 16th century philosophical shift.
The birth of the autonomous individual.
To see how a 500-year cycle of Western expansion is finally reaching its absolute limit, exhausted by impossible debt and severe cultural alienation.
It is a phenomenal, unified synthesis. It proves that you cannot understand economics without understanding geopolitics. And you cannot understand either without understanding the underlying philosophy of the culture.
And here is why this matters to you, the listener. You aren't just reading a history book. You are living inside of one. The invisible structures that dictate the value of the money you earn, the shape of the community you live in, and the stability of the geopolitical world order are fundamentally reorganizing beneath your feet as we speak.
It truly is a 1989 moment. But this time, it's not happening to a distant Soviet empire. It is happening to us.
And while understanding this complex map doesn't necessarily make the coming transition any less chaotic, it does make it legible. When you can see the deep historical patterns at play, you can navigate with awareness instead of just reacting with panic.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, building on the incredible, centuries-long scope of this source material. If the last 500 years were entirely defined by the rise of the autonomous individual and the geographic nation-state,
Right.
and if that specific 500-year cycle is truly dying right now due to extreme financialization and cultural collapse, what if the next 500-year cycle abandons the concept of the geographic nation-state entirely?
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating extrapolation of the data.
Think about the trajectory. In a world governed by artificial intelligence, borderless digital currencies, and instant global connectivity, could the next global hegemon not be a physical country at all?
What if the replacement for the American empire isn't the Chinese state or the BRICS coalition?
What if the next superpower is a decentralized global digital network? What if the dominant force of the 22nd century is a system rather than a place on a map?
That is a profound, truly unsettling question for a chaotic horizon.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It has been a dense, intense, and incredibly illuminating journey through the forces shaping our reality. Stay curious, keep critically questioning the certainties of the world around you, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.